everyone is saying, hey, we are just a couple steps away from something going bad. Let's not get cynical or skeptical or negative about it, but let's think about that, imagine that, and take proactive steps to either prevent that or get out ahead of it. Welcome to At the Table, the podcast that lives at the intersection between culture and teamwork, organizational health, and leadership. I'm your host, Pat Lencioni, joined by my trusty co-host, Cody Thompson. How you doing, Cody?
Trusty. I'm very trustworthy, or trusty, whichever you decide.
Yeah, well, I think you're both. I don't know what trusty is, but you know what's funny? I want to share this with people. We were out at the Dave Ramsey Entree Leadership event, which was a blast. It was out in Denver earlier, and it was so fun to walk down the hallway, and people would kind of recognize me, and then they'd hear us talking. They go, "Oh, you must be Cody. We know your voice." And now that we're doing this on video, a lot of people said, "Oh yeah, we recognize you now." So it's fun to have people. Your voice is famous, and now so is your face.
Oh, thank you for that, Pat.
And when I say famous, like me, mildly famous in certain quarters.
Z-list celebrity, you know?
That's right. Cody, what's the topic today?
Tension and innovation.
That's right. Tension and innovation. Here's the thing. Every organization wants to be innovative. That's one of those words like teamwork that everybody says, we want that. Nobody goes, yeah, we really don't want to be innovative. Very few organizations say that. And yet, as universal as that is, it's still pretty rare. Most organizations struggle. And we've been talking about this recently. And we think the reason why is because to be innovative, you really do have to experience tension. And most organizations, most people, human beings, don't really like the idea of having tension in their lives. And without it, you can't innovate. Innovation and creativity, by definition, requires a certain amount of discomfort. And there's actually two kinds of tension that are important. One is interpersonal tension. That's where people are tense with one another. And the other is what I would call environmental tension. And that's where things are going on in the environment that are forcing us to innovate. Now, you don't want to wait for environmental tension to innovate. That's sometimes what happens, as we like to say, necessity is the mother of invention. But sometimes that's what's required. It's even better when companies can embrace the interpersonal tension, regardless of whether they're in a crisis or not, and then innovate from there. So that's what we want to talk about today, is how we can embrace the tension that's required for innovation. Sound about right, Cody?
Yeah, and I think what made it interesting enough for us to want to pursue a conversation about it on the podcast is that most of the time that interpersonal tension is so hard for people that they'll resist it. And so it almost, unless you're careful and you wait until, most companies wait, like you said, until there's some environmental factor, some external force that causes you to have to overcome the interpersonal tension. But the best companies, the most innovative, cutting edge ones in the world, will overcome that interpersonal tension for the sake of innovation without it being forced on them.
Right. And what happens is they're like, oh, I don't want to have difficult conversations about something. And they go, oh no, we're going to go out of business. And suddenly their profile, their willingness to have difficult conversations goes up. But the best companies go, oh no, we're going to enter into that regardless of the environment. And thereby we're going to prevent a crisis. But it's because they're willing to take on the discomfort ahead of time.
What I think, what was interesting as we talked about this, Pat, was like, in some ways, we try to manufacture this in companies that we serve, because we've been with so many companies who the environmental factor is not actually forcing them. There's no necessity for them to innovate. And that can work for years and even multiple years at a time. And sometimes it can cause you to get a little lax even. Like, oh, hey, things are going really great. So we don't really need to make any changes, and you get complacent. And then you're too far behind the innovation curve at that point. And then it becomes really, really urgent. And so there was this idea about like, how do we push ourselves both interpersonally, but how do we even manufacture some environmental sort of tension to force that exercise of innovation?
Yes. And you can't do that like in a deceptive way, like, hey, everybody, the sky is falling, because then nobody's going to believe it even when the sky is falling. But what you have to do is say, let's all agree that we are going to intentionally lower the threshold around which we're willing to get dangerous, if you will, and know that that's in the best service of the organization. Now, when I think of innovation, I think of creativity, Cody, and so I'm an author. You might not know that, but I'm an author.
I've never read any books,
and I was a screenwriter before too, and the process of being creative requires conflict. That's what intention and discomfort, which is why when you watch a movie, and I can't remember the actual way to do this. There's an ampersand or there's an and or a comma. I forget what it is, but really good movies are usually written by one person, or if it's two people that are really tight and they worked on it all the way through. But when you see a movie and in the credits it says written by John Smith and Jan so-and-so, ampersand, and Fred blah, 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 you go, oh crap, this is one of those Frankenstein scripts where they passed it on to somebody else and then they worked on it and they worked on it. And that does not work. And it's one of the reasons why I've never co-authored a book with anybody. Now, Tracy is my editor, and every one of us in the office is essentially my co-author. In other words, we read it and we give me feedback. But if you're working with somebody and you're not really comfortable, you don't have a lot of trust and willing to argue with them, creativity sucks. It really becomes a compromise activity that leads to mediocrity. And so that's the idea here is, like in our company, we have tension around the books, and people will say, this character is terrible, Pat, or that idea, people aren't going to understand that. And if you don't have that level of tension, innovation, creativity, and breakthroughs really suffer.
When I think it also speaks to, like, you alluded to this in that it doesn't happen in a vacuum either, or in isolation. Not much innovation happens, or you don't get as much out of it if you try to do it in isolation, because that wrestling around the script or wrestling around the book or a new product or a new idea is, it goes back to sort of the core principles we talk about around conflict. That's part of what tension is, right? Is that there's this sharpening part of the experience, which is you throw something out there and people have some conflict around it. And more often than not, conflict arrives at a better, and tension refines something, makes it better.
Yes. And you know something, Cody, as you were talking about that, I thought, if you were to go back in time and look at the best artists and the best chefs and the best directors and writers and creative people and entrepreneurs, if you watch the sausage being made, the decisions being made, the innovation happening, it can be pretty grumpy. When you're really pressing on trying to figure out the right answer, and we've talked about this, I think, on a podcast long ago, you have to take some of the energy that you're applying toward protocol and apply it toward literally the messiness of figuring out the answer. And sometimes that means you have to be a little less cordial. And if you have trust, of course, that's fine. But if you don't, it's really ugly. And I think about two of the most innovative CEOs I've ever heard of. One of whom I got to meet, Steve Jobs, God rest his soul, before he died. He offered me a job once at Pixar, and I got to interview with him. Well, he was a pretty edgy guy, right? And everybody knew that. There's legendary stories about him being difficult on people and kind of a little bit tense and conflict oriented. And I could see that. And I think that's often the case when you're innovating. The other one is Elon Musk. Like, I don't know how this guy even thinks about a rocket ship going, and electric cars and a thing that bores tunnels in the ground. I mean, I think the thing about Elon Musk is, I think he's on the spectrum, right? Most people do. I don't think he actually even feels the nature of innovation. I think it's easy for him because he's probably not that aware of it. That would be so much harder for me to innovate in that way with a bunch of other people when I kind of had to be willing to piss them off. And my guess is that Musk doesn't really notice or care that much about that. And that probably frees him up to innovate. What do you think?
That actually brings up a question I had when we started this conversation, which is, we talk so much about innovation, and you just named two of the most innovative people, leaders of companies. Should everybody, like, I'm thinking about our listeners who are working not at making the next Pixar film and not putting people into space. Should we all value innovation the same way? Like, are there people, teams, industries, companies out there that should say, like, should we not strive for this level of tension and innovation? Or, I'm thinking a little bit about, like, discipline of market leaders. We've done a podcast on that. Is it only the companies that value, product leadership that need to constantly innovate? Or should everyone listening to this think on some level we should start embracing tension and innovating?
It's a great question. And I didn't anticipate this, but I think we should all embrace it, but in different ways. Because if you're a customer intimacy company, your innovation should be, how can we better meet our customers' needs? Or if you're an operational excellence company, how can we innovate around getting better at this? So I think it applies in every field, but in slightly different ways. Now, if you're in a world of innovating in ways that change the world completely, I guess it probably requires a little bit more. So that there probably a pencil factory versus putting a person into space is going to be slightly different. But I think every company wants to be innovative, even within the context of whatever they do. And regardless of whether that seems radical or not, it requires a level of comfort with tension that most people don't. Having said that, yeah, I'm sure there's a little bit more required in certain businesses than others.
So yeah, I don't want to skip over the two examples you used either, because the other question that came to mind as you were kind of teasing that out was, do they, you talked about both of them kind of are prone to this level of tension, whether it's emotional or kind of a fixation of the mind. But so do you think that both of them were they driven by innovation from external factors? Like, was it competition and the market? Or do you think it was that they were so personally, fine with the tension that's required to innovate that they just were able to overcome that even when there weren't external factors that forced it?
I think it's their nature that drove them into those fields because like they're in multiple industries, all of which are innovative. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes a CEO can be in a business and then the world turns upside down and requires them to innovate in a way they didn't think they had to. I mean, like you run a restaurant and you're like, oh my gosh, everybody's ordering from home. How are we going to do this? Are we going to sign up with Uber Eats? Are we going to have a drive-through? Are we going to, even somebody who runs a restaurant is going to be, it's time for us to innovate. But then there are certain entrepreneurs and leaders who are just drawn to innovation. And probably they're pretty comfortable with people disagreeing with them or forcing others to do something that they don't want to do. I am not like that. So I need to surround myself with people and have a really, really strong relationship so it's comfortable innovating. But some people are like, I don't care. I don't care if I piss people off. And I don't care if they disagree with me.
I think that's interesting. So let's say, because I think more leaders that are listening to this are maybe more like you than they are about, Elon or otherwise. So what are ways that a leader, a team, an executive team, a company can manufacture some external urgency, external motivation that would allow them to kind of embrace innovation?
That's a great question. I think the first thing everybody has to do is get very comfortable with their conflict profile. In other words, and we've talked about this, Cody, with teams we work with, go around the table and just say, how comfortable are you at disagreeing with people and pushing back and being pushed back on? Did you grow up that way? What's your personality like? And this relates to Working Genius and Myers-Briggs and your past history. And if you're not, it's important to go, I don't really like that. It's not natural to me. I know we need to do it. So I'm outing myself right now as not being good at it. So I want you guys to push me to do it. And if you feel like we're just agreeing to agree, I want you to go, hey, are you being nice again because that's how you grew up or because that's your personality? Because that would be really bad if you were just saying something to me to agree. In other words, put it out there so that you can coach one another. And yeah, you're going to have a couple people on your team who love disagreeing and arguing. And they might have to tone it down a little bit so that the other people can bring their level up a bit. So I think it's really having an honest conversation and saying, yes, we want tension because we want innovation. Let's admit when we struggle with that so people will make us do it.
I think that's a good way of overcoming interpersonal. What I thought you were going to say, the answer I thought you'd give is kind of akin to our, thematic goal, the way we create a rallying cry. Like we try to create some urgency or create a crisis for a company that says like, what is the single most important thing you need to do in the next, 3 to 6 months, which creates this sort of manufactured crises. Because I go back to, I remember 4 years ago, right after COVID, we did a podcast. And what was really fascinating to us is if COVID didn't happen and any business of any size said, we're going to put a plan in place to become a remote workforce, it's probably going to take us 8 to 12 months, you know. And if they had to plan, they'd probably plan for 8 to 12 months and then execute it over 8 to 12 months. But when there was this urgent required crises that happened that required them to take some immediate action and innovate, they did it overnight. And so there's something about manufacturing sort of a time horizon in a really short amount of time that can also force that behavior.
Yeah, I was on a podcast this morning with Chief Executive Magazine. They were asking that very question. They said, well, things are a little turbulent right now. What should we do? And I talked to them about, in the midst of COVID, we launched 2 of the biggest things we've ever done. And we thought, let's just do it now. Let's just do it quick and dirty and messy because people out there need something. And it worked. And had that not been during that time, we'd have probably taken a lot longer and been more careful, and not in a good way. And so I think that you're right, if I'm answering your question correctly. And I think one of the things that I like to do when you're not in the middle of COVID or something big that's doing this, is to ask yourself, if our company doesn't do a good job and innovate and grow, what crisis could come up? In other words, let's imagine 6 months from now, we take our eye off the ball, we don't innovate, we don't engage in conflict. What could happen that would create a crisis? And then imagine that crisis and then rally around preventing that the same way you would addressing it if it happened. Does that make sense?
Totally. I love
it's not
that
a fake
exercise.
Crisis. It's actually, that could probably happen.
Yeah. You know, the other question that came up, Pat, is like, or maybe not a question, because I've seen us do this at Table Group a handful of times, is we'll get in a room and we'll take on a topic or a business unit of ours or a product, category that we're trying to think about. And we'll have a 2 or 3 hour discussion about whether it needs to change and kind of have an innovation conversation. And the truth is that at the end of many of those, we arrive at the same process that we have right now, which is actually great, right? It's confirmation that we went through the entire innovation cycle of like sort of, hey, do we need to change this? Do we need to, anticipate a crisis, do anything else? And if you get to the end of that whole discussion and the answer is, actually, I think we're doing the right thing now, that's great, right?
That's prudence.
Right.
And for every axiom, like, necessity is the mother of invention. The other one is, what's the right one about,
discretion is the better part of
That's the one I was looking for.
There you go. Gotcha.
Right. Discretion is the better part of valor. Cody, I want to share something with people. When we're on these podcasts, I just want to let people into my brain. When you're talking, you're saying something, and then suddenly an idea comes up based on something we just talked about, and you're halfway through what you're saying, and I can't help but start responding to that in my brain. And then sometimes I might check out and not hear the second part of what you said. And then I'm responding. And I'm always like, I wonder if they think I'm not listening to him, but I'm totally focused. But it's really hard to listen, process, and come up with the next thing you're going to say.
Well, Pat, I'm pretty sure when I'm talking, that's a very common listener experience to check out while I'm talking. So I think that they're tracking with that the whole time.
That's what Lindsay said. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I was thinking about, though, was this idea of the crisis and not creating a false crisis, but anticipating one. And I think that it's one of the things that Andy Grove said years ago at Intel, only the paranoid survive. I think he wrote a book called that. And I think people don't like that title because like paranoid, but it's like, there's a place for healthy paranoia. And that is like, something could go wrong. Let's imagine what that might be, and let's get ahead of that. And the best football coaches, the best leaders, everyone is saying, hey, we are just a couple steps away from something going bad. Let's not get cynical or skeptical or negative about it, but let's think about that, imagine that, and take proactive steps to either prevent that or get out ahead of it. So there's probably a healthy paranoia that also creates the environment where people are willing to engage in interpersonal tension.
Well, I really like that. And I would even maybe go as far, we talked about whether fear or joy kind of drives your leadership. I think fear or joy can kind of drive innovation too, right? You can do it out of a paranoia that's somebody might come steal your customers or, innovate in your sector of the market. Or while things are really good, when they say the best time to look for a job is while you have one, sometimes the best time to innovate is actually when things are going well. Not to like steer the ship way off course, but to say like, hey, let's not we don't necessarily need to innovate out of necessity, like out of fear that something wrong is going to happen, but we can take some proactive steps to do it regularly.
You know what's funny? You were saying that because I think there's such a thing as joyful fear. Like, oh my gosh, something crazy could happen. Let's have fun figuring out what we would do if that happened. And then there's I would call it a panicky fear or a negative fear, which is like, oh no, things would be terrible if that happened. And I think the best organizations love innovating as though there's a tidal wave about to happen, but they're not afraid of it. They're like, yeah. And I was on this podcast this morning. We were talking about in uncertain times, healthy organizations that embrace conflict and tension, they're actually like, yeah, if the ship got hit by a big wave right now, that would be kind of exciting. What would we do? They don't sit and go, oh no, if that happened, it would be the end of us. And it's the difference between being nimble and resilient and being fearful and at risk, I think.
I like it. I mean, I think that the practical application, both from an external, like how do we manufacture some or anticipate a crisis and innovate towards that? And then I love the interpersonal tips, because I do think that even in the midst of some crises, the distaste for interpersonal turmoil will prevent people from engaging in innovation. And so even if you had the external factor, it really matters that your team has the trust and the vulnerability and the capability of engaging in that type of innovation, because you might even miss it even if it's forced on you.
Yeah. And here's what I love to say to CEOs. You know who will leave or if things get crazy, or even if they're not yet crazy, but you're not having tension and healthy conflict in order to innovate, the people that will leave that organization are the best people, because they thrive on that. Not on negativity, but they thrive on that real, honest, raw tension. The people that hate that will stay. And oftentimes leaders will go, oh no, you mean I could lose those two people and they would all stay? I should create healthy tension so that more of these people that don't like it will come along. And maybe the people that really, really, really can't tolerate it at all, maybe they'll opt out on their own. Let's make this practical. Let's land this plane in a practical way. I think everybody should sit down with their team, and regardless of the business they're in or their position, and just say, do we want to be more innovative? And if everybody's like, no, I think we're fine. Okay. But I think most times everybody, yeah. And then do we have enough discomfort, tension, and healthy conflict to get there? And if not, why? And I will bet that most people will say, I think we don't think it's allowed. I don't know that it's actually encouraged or rewarded. Mm-hmm. And having that conversation will probably open you up more to greater tolerance for tension and for innovation. That's what I'm thinking.
I love it. That's a good call to action.
That we're done. All right. Thanks, Cody. Appreciate it, buddy. It's great to see you. Thanks to everybody for watching. We love being able to share this stuff with you, and we appreciate your feedback. God bless.